In the autumn of 1926, a single photograph would haunt the halls of Willowbrook State Asylum for decades to come. Not because of what was meant to be captured, but because of what should never have been there at all. The photograph was taken on a crisp October morning by Dr. Edmund Hartley, the asylum's newest administrator, who had arrived from Boston with grand visions of reform and modern psychiatric care. He believed documentation was essential, that progress needed to be measured not just in records and reports, but in images that could show the world how far enlightened medicine had come. So he purchased a Kodak Brownie camera and began photographing the facility, its staff, and its daily operations. The asylum, located on the outskirts of Albany, New York, was a sprawling Gothic structure with ivy-covered walls and narrow windows that seemed to watch visitors as they approached. Built in 1892, it housed nearly 300 patients, most suffering from what doctors of the era vaguely termed nervous disorders or melancholia. On that particular morning, Dr. Hartley decided to photograph the main recreation hall during its weekly cleaning. The room was empty, or so everyone believed. The orderlies had just finished mopping the floors, and the autumn sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the freshly polished tiles. Dr. Hartley positioned himself near the doorway, adjusted the camera settings, and took the shot. The shutter clicked, capturing what appeared to be nothing more than an empty room with rows of wooden benches, a piano in the corner, and pale yellow walls that had recently been repainted. He made a note in his leather journal, numbered the exposure, and moved on to photograph the women's ward. 3 weeks passed before the photographs were developed at Muller's photography studio on Madison Avenue in downtown Albany. Dr. Hartley collected them on a grey November afternoon, paying the clerk $2 for the development work. He returned to his office at Willowbrook, spread the photographs across his mahogany desk, and began sorting them for his quarterly report to the State Review Board. Most showed exactly what he expected: clean hallways, orderly nurses' stations, patients engaged in supervised activities. Then he reached the photograph of the recreation hall. At first glance it looked perfectly normal. The empty room, the benches, the piano, the light pouring through the windows. But something made him pause. Perhaps it was the way his eyes kept being drawn to the back corner near the piano. He held the photograph closer, squinting in the dim office light. Then he saw it. Standing in the shadows, barely visible against the dark wood paneling, was a child. A small figure, no more than 7 or 8 years old, wearing what appeared to be a pale nightgown. And the child was smiling. Dr. Hartley's hands trembled as he reached for the magnifying glass he kept in his desk drawer. Under magnification, the details became clearer and somehow more disturbing. The child's smile was wide, almost unnaturally so, and the eyes seemed to be looking directly at the camera, directly at him. Across the span of 3 weeks, and the chemical bath of the developing process, the face was pale, the features delicate, the hair dark and hanging limply to the shoulders. But it was the smile that unsettled him most. It wasn't the smile of a child at play, or even a child posing for a photograph. It was something else entirely, something that suggested knowledge that no child should possess. He set down the magnifying glass and walked to his office window, staring out at the asylum grounds where patients shuffled along supervised walking paths in the fading afternoon light. His mind raced through possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. Dr. Hartley spent the rest of that afternoon reviewing the asylum's admission records, searching for any mention of a child, matching the description of the figure in the photograph. Willowbrook State Asylum was not licensed to house children under the age of 12, a policy that had been in effect since its founding. The youngest patient currently in residence was a 15-year-old girl named Margaret Sullivan, who had been committed 6 months earlier after what her family described as a nervous breakdown. Yet the figure in the photograph was clearly much younger, perhaps no older than 8. He called for Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, the head nurse who had worked at Willowbrook for 17 years and knew every patient by name. She arrived at his office promptly at 5 o'clock, still wearing her starched white uniform and carrying the leather-bound daily log she maintained with meticulous care. Dr. Hartley showed her the photograph without explanation, watching her face carefully as she studied the image. Her expression shifted from curiosity to confusion, then to something that might have been recognition, though she quickly masked it. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice steady but her fingers gripping the photograph's edges a bit too tightly. Dr. Hartley explained that he had taken it himself 3 weeks earlier, during the morning cleaning of the recreation hall. The room had been empty, he insisted. Absolutely empty. Mrs. Walsh set the photograph on his desk and clasped her hands in front of her, a gesture he had come to recognize as her way of preparing to deliver difficult news. She told him about Sarah Brennan. The name appeared in no current records because Sarah had not been an official patient. She had been the daughter of Thomas Brennan, one of the asylum's orderlies who had worked there from 1919 until his death in 1924. Thomas's wife had died during the influenza epidemic of 1918, leaving him to raise Sarah alone on the meager wages the asylum provided. With no family to care for her, while he worked his long shifts, Thomas had begun bringing Sarah to the asylum, hiding her in unused storage rooms and the less frequented areas of the facility. The staff who knew about it had looked the other way, understanding that a man had to work and a child had to be somewhere. Sarah had been a quiet, obedient child who learned to make herself invisible, to move through the halls like a shadow, to entertain herself for hours in empty rooms. She had loved the recreation hall, Mrs. Walsh recalled, especially the piano. Sometimes, when no one was watching, she would press the keys gently, creating soft melodies that drifted through the corridors like whispers. The staff had grown fond of her in their way, this small ghost of a girl who existed in the margins of the institution's daily routine. Then, Thomas Brennan had collapsed during his shift in August 1924, a massive heart attack that killed him before the asylum's doctor could reach him. The staff had searched for Sarah, but she had vanished. They assumed she had run away or been taken in by some distant relative, but Mrs. Walsh had always wondered, because Sarah had nowhere to go and no one to go to. And now, here she was in Dr. Hartley's photograph 2 years later, still smiling in the empty recreation hall. Dr. Hartley spent the following days investigating every corner of the asylum, searching for evidence that Sarah Brennan might still be living somewhere within its walls. The task proved more difficult than he had anticipated. Willowbrook was a labyrinth of corridors, storage rooms, basement tunnels, and abandoned wings that had been closed off as patient numbers fluctuated over the years. Some areas had not been accessed in months, perhaps years. Their doors locked and their keys long misplaced. He enlisted the help of Jacob Mueller, the asylum's maintenance supervisor, a grizzled man in his 60s who had worked at Willowbrook since its opening. Jacob knew the building better than anyone, including passages and rooms that appeared on no official floor plans. Together they began a systematic search, starting with the areas closest to the recreation hall and working outward. They found evidence of human habitation in several locations: a storage room on the 3rd floor, where someone had arranged old blankets into a makeshift bed, a corner of the basement laundry where food scraps had been carefully hidden behind a row of broken washing machines, a disused office where a child's drawings covered the walls in faded pencil. The drawings were crude but recognizable, stick figures of nurses and doctors making their rounds, patients sitting in rows in the dining hall, and repeated sketches of the recreation hall with its distinctive piano. In one corner, Sarah had drawn what appeared to be her father, a tall man with kind eyes standing beside a much smaller figure holding his hand. The date penciled beneath it read, April 1924, just 4 months before Thomas Brennan's death. Dr. Hartley photographed each location, documenting what he increasingly believed to be proof that Sarah had survived alone in the asylum for more than 2 years. The realization was both remarkable and horrifying. How had a child managed to feed herself, to stay warm during brutal New York winters, to avoid detection by hundreds of staff members and patients? The answer, he gradually understood, lay in the very nature of asylum life. Willowbrook was a place where people learned not to see, not to question, not to acknowledge anything that disrupted the carefully maintained illusion of order and control. Food went missing from the kitchens regularly, but the staff blamed rats or dishonest workers. Strange sounds in the walls were attributed to old pipes and settling foundations. Fleeting glimpses of movement in empty corridors were dismissed as tricks of light or the wanderings of confused patients who had slipped away from supervision. In an environment where reality itself was constantly questioned, where the boundary between sanity and madness blurred daily, one small girl could apparently exist unnoticed, living in the spaces between official recognition and institutional blindness. But Dr. Hartley's most disturbing discovery came when he accessed the asylum's financial records. Every month, small amounts of money had been withdrawn from the general fund and marked as miscellaneous expenses. The amounts were tiny, never more than a few dollars, but they had been occurring consistently since September 1924, just 1 month after Thomas Brennan's death. Someone had been taking care of Sarah, feeding her, protecting her, ensuring her survival, while keeping her existence secret. And that someone was still working at Willowbrook. The revelation that someone on staff had been actively concealing Sarah's presence changed everything. Dr. Hartley could no longer treat this as simply a strange mystery or an administrative oversight. This was a deliberate conspiracy, one that had persisted for more than 2 years and involved at least one member of his staff, possibly more. He began reviewing personnel files, looking for anyone who had shown unusual interest in the asylum's unused spaces or who had access to the financial records where the mysterious withdrawals had been documented. His investigation led him to Victoria Chen, a kitchen supervisor who had immigrated from China in 1910 and had worked at Willowbrook since 1920. Victoria was known for her efficiency and discretion, qualities that had made her invaluable in managing the complex task of feeding 300 patients and 50 staff members 3 times daily. She rarely spoke unless necessary, kept impeccable records, and had never been the subject of any complaint or disciplinary action. She was, in every measurable way, an exemplary employee. Dr. Hartley called Victoria to his office on a cold December morning, 3 weeks after he had first noticed the child in his photograph. He laid out his evidence carefully: the drawings, the hidden sleeping spaces, the financial irregularities, and finally, the photograph itself. Victoria studied the image for a long moment, her face revealing nothing. Then she looked up at Dr. Hartley with eyes that held both defiance and resignation. She admitted everything. After Thomas Brennan's death, she had found Sarah hiding in a linen closet, terrified and alone. The child had begged Victoria not to send her away, explaining that she had nowhere to go and that her father had always told her the asylum was safe, that the people who worked there were kind. Victoria had intended to report Sarah's presence to the administration, but something had stopped her. Perhaps it was the memory of her own arrival in America, alone and frightened in a country that saw her as foreign and strange. Perhaps it was the knowledge that the state orphanage where Sarah would be sent was notorious for its cruelty and neglect. Or perhaps it was simply that after years of working in an institution dedicated to housing society's forgotten people, Victoria had grown tired of adding one more name to that endless list. So she had made a choice. She had become Sarah's secret protector, bringing her food, finding her safe places to sleep, teaching her how to move through the asylum undetected. The financial withdrawals had been for necessities: clothing as Sarah grew, medicine when she fell ill, small comforts to make her invisible life more bearable. Victoria had done this alone, trusting no one else with the knowledge, bearing the entire burden of Sarah's secret existence. Dr. Hartley listened to Victoria's confession with growing unease. By any reasonable standard, she should be terminated immediately, and possibly prosecuted. She had embezzled funds, harbored an unauthorized person in a state institution, and maintained a conspiracy that could destroy his credibility and Willowbrook's reputation. But as he looked at the photograph again, at that small, smiling figure who had somehow survived 2 years in the shadows of an asylum, he found himself questioning what justice actually meant in this situation. That night, Dr. Hartley made a decision that would define the rest of his tenure at Willowbrook State Asylum. Dr. Hartley's decision was not made lightly, nor was it made alone. Over the following week, he met privately with Victoria Chen 3 more times, each conversation revealing more about Sarah's life in the shadows of Willowbrook and about Victoria herself. He learned that Victoria had fled Guangdong province in 1909 after her family was killed in anti-Chinese riots, arriving in San Francisco with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination to survive. She had worked her way across the country, taking any job that would have her, enduring prejudice and exploitation, until she finally found stable employment at Willowbrook. The asylum had been her sanctuary, the first place in America where she had felt something approaching safety. When she found Sarah hiding and terrified after Thomas Brennan's death, Victoria had seen her own younger self, displaced and alone in a hostile world. Sarah, Victoria explained, was not simply surviving in the asylum. She was thriving in her own peculiar way. The child had learned to read by studying discarded newspapers and magazines left in the recreation hall. She had taught herself to play simple melodies on the piano by listening to the weekly concerts the asylum organized for patients. She knew the names and stories of dozens of patients, gleaning information from overheard conversations and careful observation. In many ways, Sarah understood Willowbrook better than most of the staff who worked there openly. She had spent 2 years studying the institution from the inside, learning its rhythms and patterns, its moments of chaos and calm, its possibilities and dangers. Dr. Hartley asked to meet Sarah. Victoria hesitated, explaining that the child had grown extraordinarily wary of strangers, that trust did not come easily to someone who had learned to survive by remaining invisible. But she agreed to arrange a meeting, choosing a time and place carefully. 3 days before Christmas 1926, as snow fell softly over the asylum grounds, Dr. Hartley waited in the recreation hall after evening rounds. Victoria arrived with Sarah just after 8 o'clock, when the hallways were empty and the patients were confined to their dormitories. Sarah Brennan was small for her age, 10 years old, but appearing no more than 7 or 8. Her dark hair had been cut short, a practical choice for someone living in hiding. She wore clothes that had clearly been altered multiple times to fit her growing frame, and her shoes were scuffed and worn. But it was her eyes that captured Dr. Hartley's attention. They were old eyes that had seen too much and understood too well the precariousness of her existence. She studied him with a directness that most adults found uncomfortable, evaluating him with the careful assessment of someone whose survival depended on reading people accurately. He spoke to her gently, asking about her life, her memories of her father, her days in the asylum. Sarah answered in a soft voice, articulate and intelligent, describing a world that existed in the margins of institutional life. She talked about watching the seasons change through the recreation hall windows, about listening to patients tell stories of their lives before Willowbrook, about the small kindnesses she had witnessed between nurses and patients in unguarded moments. She spoke of loneliness and fear, but also of wonder at the human capacity for resilience in the face of suffering. Dr. Hartley asked Sarah what she wanted. The question seemed to surprise her, as if no one had ever considered that her desires might matter. She thought for a long moment before answering. She wanted to stay, she said. Willowbrook was the only home she remembered clearly. Her father was buried in the asylum cemetery, and she visited his grave when she could slip outside unnoticed. The patients and staff were her family, even if most of them did not know she existed. She did not want to be sent to an orphanage or placed with strangers who would never understand where she had come from or who she had become. Dr. Hartley looked at Victoria, then back at Sarah, and made his decision. He would not report Sarah's presence to the state authorities. Instead, he would find a way to give her a legitimate place within Willowbrook, to transform her from an invisible ghost into a recognized member of the asylum community. The plan he devised was risky and would require the cooperation of several staff members, but he believed it was possible, and more importantly, he believed it was right. The transformation of Sarah Brennan from hidden child to official ward of Willowbrook State Asylum required careful planning and the complicity of more people than Dr. Hartley had initially anticipated. He began by confiding in Dr. Margaret Aldrich, the asylum's senior physician, and the only other administrator he trusted completely. Margaret had worked at Willowbrook for 12 years and had earned a reputation for both medical competence and moral courage. She listened to Dr. Hartley's account of Sarah's situation without interruption, her expression moving from disbelief to anger to something resembling admiration for the child's resourcefulness and Victoria's loyalty. Margaret's immediate concern was Sarah's health. A child who had spent 2 years living in hiding, subsisting on stolen food, and sleeping in unheated storage rooms could be suffering from malnutrition, untreated illnesses, or developmental delays. She insisted on conducting a thorough medical examination before any other steps were taken. The examination took place in Margaret's private office late one evening, with Victoria present to help Sarah feel safe. What Margaret discovered was remarkable. Despite her circumstances, Sarah was in relatively good health. She showed signs of past malnutrition and had suffered several bouts of respiratory illness. But Victoria's care had prevented any serious long-term damage. The child was underweight but not dangerously so, and her cognitive abilities were well above average for her age. The legal challenge of establishing Sarah's presence at Willowbrook proved more complex. Dr. Hartley could not simply admit her as a patient, as she showed no signs of mental illness, and the asylum was not licensed to house healthy children. Creating false admission papers would be fraud, and could result in criminal charges if discovered. After days of research into New York state regulations, Margaret suggested a solution. The asylum could hire Sarah as a ward worker, a category that had existed briefly in the early 1920s for older children who assisted with basic tasks in exchange for room, board, and a small wage. The category had been discontinued in 1924 due to labor law changes, but it had never been formally removed from Willowbrook's employment authorization documents. Dr. Hartley drafted the paperwork carefully, backdating Sarah's employment to January 1925, several months after her father's death. The document stated that she had been hired as an assistant to the housekeeping staff, working under Victoria Chen's supervision. He forged signatures where necessary and inserted the paperwork into the appropriate files. If anyone investigated, the timeline would be problematic, but Dr. Hartley was gambling that no one would have reason to scrutinize employment records for a minor position from 2 years earlier. The more difficult challenge was introducing Sarah to the asylum community as if she had been there all along. Dr. Hartley called a meeting with the senior staff, including Mrs. Walsh, Jacob Mueller, and the heads of each patient ward. He explained that he had discovered irregularities in employment records and had found that a ward worker had been omitted from official rosters due to clerical error. Sarah would now be properly documented and would take on visible duties throughout the asylum. He instructed staff to treat her as if she had always been part of the Willowbrook workforce, to avoid questions or speculation about her history. The reactions varied. Mrs. Walsh, who had known about Sarah from the beginning, accepted the explanation with obvious relief. Jacob Mueller, who had helped Dr. Hartley search for evidence of Sarah's presence, understood immediately what was being attempted and nodded his approval. Several other staff members looked confused, but were too intimidated by Dr. Hartley's authority to raise objections. Only one person openly questioned the arrangement, Thomas Garrett, the asylum's bookkeeper, who pointed out that employment records from 1925 should show payroll disbursements that he could not locate. Dr. Hartley had anticipated this objection. He explained that the ward worker position had been funded through a separate discretionary account that had since been discontinued, and that Victoria Chen had been responsible for maintaining those records. The explanation was deliberately vague and would not withstand serious scrutiny, but it was enough to satisfy Garrett's immediate concerns. The meeting concluded with Dr. Hartley emphasizing that Sarah's situation was now resolved and that he expected all staff to support her integration into the asylum's daily operations. Sarah's transition from invisible ghost to recognized worker happened gradually over the following weeks. She began by appearing openly in areas where staff had glimpsed her before, allowing people to grow accustomed to her presence. Victoria introduced her to kitchen workers as her new assistant, and Sarah demonstrated such competence that within days she seemed indispensable. She helped prepare meals, cleaned dining areas, and ran errands between departments with an efficiency that impressed even the most skeptical staff members. The winter of 1927 brought unexpected challenges to Willowbrook State Asylum. A severe influenza outbreak struck in late January, affecting more than 60 patients and a dozen staff members. The asylum's small infirmary was quickly overwhelmed, and Dr. Hartley ordered the conversion of the recreation hall into a temporary hospital ward. Beds were brought in, medical supplies were requisitioned from Albany, and all non-essential activities were suspended as the staff focused on containing the outbreak and caring for the sick. Sarah proved invaluable during the crisis. Her years of invisible observation had taught her the layout of the asylum better than anyone, and she could locate supplies and navigate the building's maze of corridors faster than workers who had been there for years. More importantly, her small size and quiet demeanor made her non-threatening to patients who were confused or frightened by their illness. She moved through the recreation hall-turned-hospital ward with a calm efficiency, bringing water to feverish patients, changing linens and sitting with those who were too ill to be left alone. Dr. Margaret Aldrich noticed something remarkable during those difficult weeks. Patients responded to Sarah differently than they did to adult staff. The child's presence seemed to calm them, to break through the confusion and fear that illness often brought to people already struggling with mental distress. One elderly woman who had been mute for 3 years began speaking again when Sarah sat beside her bed, triggered by memories of her own daughter at that age. A young man prone to violent outbursts remained peaceful when Sarah was nearby, later explaining to Dr. Aldrich that the child reminded him of his younger sister, the only person who had visited him during his 5 years at Willowbrook. The crisis deepened in early February, when 3 patients died within a single week, their bodies weakened by age and chronic illness, unable to withstand the influenza's assault. The deaths hit the asylum community hard. Staff who had cared for these patients for years mourned openly, and other patients became anxious and withdrawn, sensing the loss even if they could not fully articulate their grief. Dr. Hartley ordered memorial services, small gatherings where staff and patients could acknowledge the deceased and find some measure of comfort in community. Sarah attended each service, standing quietly in the back of the chapel. After the 3rd funeral, Dr. Hartley found her in the cemetery, standing before her father's grave. The stone marker was simple, bearing only Thomas Brennan's name and the dates of his birth and death. Sarah had placed wildflowers on the grave, flowers she must have gathered from somewhere during one of her nighttime expeditions through the asylum grounds. Dr. Hartley approached slowly, giving the child space to notice his presence before he spoke. They stood together in silence for several minutes before Sarah began to talk. She spoke about her father, about memories that had faded to fragments over the past 2.5 years. She remembered his hands, rough from physical labor, but gentle when he braided her hair. She remembered his voice telling her stories about Ireland where he had been born, about green hills and grey seas and a life he had left behind to come to America. She remembered his sadness, the grief he carried for her mother, who had died when Sarah was only 6 years old. And she remembered his death, the moment when she realized she was utterly alone, when the terror of that aloneness had driven her to hide rather than face an uncertain future. Dr. Hartley listened without interruption, understanding that Sarah was processing not just her father's death, but all the losses she had witnessed in recent weeks. When she finally fell silent, he told her something he had been thinking about since he first discovered her existence. He said that her father would be proud of her survival and resourcefulness, proud of her kindness toward the patients, and her courage in facing each uncertain day. Sarah looked up at him with those old, knowing eyes and asked a question that surprised him. Did Dr. Hartley think her father would be angry that she had chosen to stay at Willowbrook instead of seeking a normal life outside the asylum walls? The question revealed the burden Sarah had been carrying, the guilt that came from choosing safety over freedom, from accepting her liminal existence rather than risking the unknown. Dr. Hartley considered his answer carefully. He told Sarah that her father had brought her to Willowbrook because he believed it was a place of care and healing, a place where people helped each other through difficult times. By choosing to stay and to contribute to that mission, Sarah was honoring her father's memory in the most meaningful way possible. She had found purpose in an improbable place, and that was something to celebrate rather than regret. The influenza outbreak finally subsided in late February, leaving the asylum exhausted but intact. 15 patients had died, a devastating loss, but the toll would have been higher without the extraordinary efforts of the staff. Dr. Hartley commended everyone at a general meeting, specifically mentioning Sarah's contributions. Several staff members applauded, and Dr. Hartley noticed that they were looking at Sarah not with suspicion or curiosity, but with genuine appreciation and respect. Spring arrived at Willowbrook State Asylum with a softness that seemed miraculous after the brutal winter. Trees on the grounds began to bud, and patients who had been confined indoors for months returned to supervised walks along the paths that wound through the property. The recreation hall, restored to its original purpose, once again hosted weekly concerts and social gatherings. And Sarah Brennan, no longer a ghost but a recognized member of the asylum community, began to discover what it meant to live openly in the world. Dr. Hartley arranged for Sarah to receive formal education. A retired schoolteacher named Helen Morrison, who volunteered at the asylum twice weekly to work with younger patients, agreed to tutor Sarah in reading, mathematics, and history. Helen quickly discovered that Sarah's self-directed education during her years in hiding had been remarkably comprehensive. The child read at a level several years beyond her age and had a natural aptitude for numbers. What Sarah lacked was formal structure and the social skills that came from interacting with peers. Helen worked to address these gaps while nurturing Sarah's obvious intelligence and curiosity. Victoria Chen remained Sarah's primary guardian, though Dr. Hartley established a formal oversight arrangement that included regular check-ins with Dr. Aldrich and quarterly reviews of Sarah's health and development. The relationship between Victoria and Sarah deepened into something resembling a traditional mother-daughter bond, though neither used those terms explicitly. They shared a small cottage on the asylum grounds that had previously been used for storage, and Victoria taught Sarah to cook traditional Chinese dishes while sharing stories of her own childhood in Guangdong province. Sarah, in turn, taught Victoria to play simple songs on the piano, the two of them practicing together in the recreation hall during quiet evening hours. The photograph that had started everything remained in Dr. Hartley's desk drawer. He looked at it occasionally, studying that smiling figure in the shadows, remembering the moment when Sarah's existence had shifted from mystery to moral dilemma to human obligation. He never showed it to Sarah, uncertain whether seeing herself from that period would be helpful or harmful. The photograph had served its purpose, revealing a hidden truth that demanded acknowledgement and action. Now it existed as a private reminder of the choices people make when confronted with situations that official policies never anticipated. As months passed, Sarah became an integral part of Willowbrook's daily operations. She assisted in the kitchen, helped maintain supply inventories, and continued to demonstrate an unusual ability to calm and connect with patients. Dr. Aldrich began training Sarah in basic nursing care, teaching her to take vital signs, change dressings, and recognize symptoms that required immediate medical attention. Sarah absorbed this knowledge eagerly, finding purpose in work that allowed her to help people who, like her, existed at the margins of society's concern. In June 1927, nearly 7 months after Dr. Hartley had first noticed the child in his photograph, Willowbrook received notice of an upcoming inspection by the State Board of Charities. Such inspections were routine but thorough, examining everything from patient care protocols to financial records to employment documentation. Dr. Hartley spent sleepless nights reviewing the false paperwork he had created for Sarah, searching for inconsistencies that might trigger scrutiny. Victoria appeared calm, but Dr. Hartley noticed her hands trembling when she thought no one was watching. The inspection lasted 3 days. State officials interviewed staff, reviewed documents, toured facilities, and observed patient care. They asked about Sarah's employment, but only in passing, satisfied by the explanation that she was a ward worker under Victoria Chen's supervision. The officials were more interested in the asylum's response to the winter influenza outbreak and impressed by the low mortality rate compared to other institutions. They commended Dr. Hartley's leadership and noted particular appreciation for the integration of patients into therapeutic activities. The final report, issued 6 weeks later, gave Willowbrook high marks in all evaluated categories. Dr. Hartley stood in his office after receiving the inspection results, feeling relief mixed with acknowledgement of ongoing risk. Sarah's existence at Willowbrook was now officially documented and state-approved, but the foundation of that approval rested on falsified records and collective deception. He had made peace with that moral complexity, recognizing that sometimes justice required working outside the rigid structures of institutional policy. Years later, when Dr. Hartley retired from Willowbrook in 1948, Sarah Brennan was 29 years old and serving as the asylum's head of patient services, a position she had earned through dedication, competence, and an unmatched understanding of the institution and the people it served. She had never left Willowbrook, choosing instead to build a life in the place that had sheltered her through childhood tragedy and adolescent growth. Her father's grave remained a place she visited regularly, bringing fresh flowers and sitting in quiet communion with memory. The photograph stayed in Dr. Hartley's possession until his death in 1956. In his will, he left it to Sarah with a brief note. Evidence of a choice that changed 2 lives and reminded one doctor why he entered medicine. Sarah kept the photograph in a frame on her desk, that smiling child in the shadows, serving as testament to survival, kindness, and the unexpected ways human lives intersect and transform each other in even the most improbable circumstances. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.